Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. This week, the most lucrative contract ever signed in cycling. Tadej Pogačar will be with UAE team Emirates until the end of 2027. I'll be looking at how much that might be worth. We've also got the latest from the Olympic Games in Tokyo, the Clásica San Sebastián races from Saturday, the Tour de l'Ain, and a bumper edition of transfer news and gossip. First up, Tadej Pogačar. On his way home from Tokyo, where he added a bronze medal to the second Tour de France win he'd taken a week before, he stepped off in the UAE to meet with the team president, whose name I have absolutely no hope of pronouncing correctly, but I'll give it a stab. Mata Suhai Al-Yabhuni Al-Dahiri. As well as congratulating him on his recent success, Dahiri also presented him with his new contract, which will keep him at the team for the next 6.5 years through to at least the end of 2027. It's the longest contract that I've ever heard of in pro cycling, but it's not a surprise that they want to ensure the long-term services of the most talented Grand Tour rider out there. Now, it sounds like a long time, 6.5 years, and it is. However, by the end of it, Pogačar will be the ripe old age of 29. Yeah, he won't even be 30 by then, and he'll still be younger than Vincenzo Nibali, Bradley Wiggins or Cadel Evans were when they took their only Tour de France title, younger than Chris Froome was when he took his second. And when you look at it like that, it's another reminder of just how young Pogačar still is. If I think about it too much, it boggles my mind, if I'm completely honest. Now, whilst we know the details of the duration of the contract, we don't know the finer details of the salary. So I contacted 5 rider agents to get their educated guesses as to how much the contract might be worth. Estimates range from €4 million per year to 8, but if I average the responses, it comes out at just over €5 million per year. So, as a 22-year-old, Pogačar has just signed a 6-year contract that's likely to be worth over €30 million. Not bad. I'd definitely consider signing on the dotted line for something like that. Does that make it the most lucrative contract in the history of pro cycling? Well, that's very hard to know, as rider salaries are rarely divulged. Sagan was reportedly on a similar amount with Bora Hansgrohe, but he's just coming to the end of his time with that team, which was 5 years, not 6. Lance Armstrong no doubt earned more than that over a number of years during his career, but only if you include separate endorsements. I very much doubt the salary he received only from his team would have been more than Pogačar's, even if you take inflation into account. What does it all mean? Not a whole lot really, just that UAE Team Emirates have a very big budget and Tadej Pogačar will be an even richer young man. Will it affect him or the way he races? From what I've seen so far, I very much doubt it. He already received 2 pay rises after his 3rd place at La Vuelta at the age of 20 and then after his first Tour de France win at the age of 21. He's already earning a lot of money, but that hasn't reduced his desire to win. He has 29 wins to his name already as a pro rider, and of recent male cycling greats, only Peter Sagan has had more by the same age. So, it will be interesting to see whether or not money and long-term security have any effect on Pogačar's desire and therefore results, but from what I've seen so far, I very much doubt it. He loves racing his bike, and he celebrated the bronze medal in Tokyo as though it were a gold. There are some people in life who make a lot of money and then decide to use it to live a less stressful life, and there are others, business and sports people alike, who get rich but continue in what they do because that's what they enjoy. Elon Musk, Lionel Messi, Ronaldo and Richard Branson, to name just a few. So whilst we have seen cyclists who fade after signing for a shed load of wedge, I don't think Pogačar will be one of them. Your thoughts may differ though, and if they do, let us know in the comments section just down below. I'd love to hear what you think about his new contract, what it means for Pogačar, or maybe even for cycling in general. Right, let's move on now to some actual racing, shall we? And the Clásica San Sebastián. The 2nd edition of the women's and the 40th edition of the men's race took place on Saturday in the Basque Country. The start list weren't quite as stacked as they have been in the past due to the proximity of the Olympic Games, but that didn't stop a number of riders jetting back to compete, including Annemiek van Vleuten. She was clearly relishing being back with her Movistar team, who rode to perfection to set her up, keeping an attack by Audrey Cordon-Ragot under control, with Van Vleuten then making her move on the final climb with 9Ks to go. She would soon catch and pass the French woman, and from that moment onwards, the win had basically been decided. Behind her, former US champion Ruth Winder distanced the rest of the front group over the top of that final climb, but for her, already 45 seconds behind Van Vleuten, it was really just about securing second place. There was a slight scare for the European champion on the final wet, slippery descent, but from there, it was plain sailing. She would eventually cross the line 36 seconds clear of Winder, with Ale BTC Ljubljana's Tatiana Gudurzo in third. Let's hear from Van Vleuten now.
I'm so proud of my team. Like, winning is nice, but do it all together with all six. And we did it, I think, quite well, so professional. I'm so proud of the team. Like, we stayed all together, came together after the climb, and then they start to ride. And yeah, I felt tired and a bit jet lagged. But then if the team is working so hard, I have to finish it off.
In high praise there of her Movistar team, and she already had talked about that to one of her team staff on her way to the podium.
And all the team in front? Because then it's extra nice. Everyone has a part of it. It's so nice.
I think the rest did a good job.
Sometimes in the Olympics I missed a team. There I had a team.
In the Olympics, I didn't have a team, but here I had a team. It's obvious from that comment that she feels she should have had more help from the Dutch squad at the Olympic Games. Meanwhile, in the men's race, held under equally wet and therefore treacherous conditions, we didn't have the race that many of us expected. Despite the absence of some big names, we did have 4 former winners on the start line: Julian Alaphilippe, Adam Yates, Luis Leon Sanchez and Bauke Mollema. On top of that, Egan Bernal was back competing for the first time since his win at the Giro d'Italia. Vingegaard was there for Jumbo-Visma, and UAE Team Emirates had brought a very strong team with Ulissi, Kovi and the young sensation Juan Ayuso also making his debut in the World Tour. However, none of those names were a factor in the group that contested the win. Mikel Landa, also competing for the first time since he crashed out of the Giro, was the first big name to attack. He went on the penultimate climb of the day, catching the remaining rider from the day's early break, former triathlete Roma of Astana. He put on quite the show. Now, the move of Landa drew a response from Simon Carr of EF Education Nippo, and the brief excitement of the return of Landismo soon faded as he was unable to hold the wheel of the Englishman, who crested that climb with around 40 seconds of an advantage. The decisive move of the day, though, would come from a descent, unusually in this race. Mohoric, who'd already been on the attack, plus Mikel Honoré, Lorenzo Rota and Neilson Powless went clear, the American not having to contribute with his teammates still up the road. They would eventually come together to form a group of 5 at the head of the race, and with no organised chase behind, it soon became clear the win would come from one of them. There were a number of attacks on the final climb of the day, but all but Carr would be back together on the final descent until this. Mohoric getting his line completely wrong on that right-hander, causing Rota and Honoré to crash as they reacted behind. Powless had got through unscathed though and was leading the race with under 5 kilometres remaining. Mohoric would get back on with just over 2 k's to go, Honoré soon after that, and so we had a sprint from 3. Mohoric decided to take it up from the front, launching his sprint with over 200 metres remaining, which would turn out to be the perfect lead out for Powless. The American managed to inch round Mohoric before the line to take his first win as a pro rider, and not a bad place or race to get yourself off the mark. Powless is the first American to win a men's World Tour one-day race since Tyler Farrer at Hamburg 11 years ago, and he's also the first native American ever to ride the Tour de France, which he did last year. He comes from a family of top-level sports people. His mum ran the marathon at the 1982 Olympics, his dad was a triathlete, and his sister Shayna is a pro cyclist herself. Anyway, here's what Neilson had to say after his win.
We had our director, Juanma, was so excited for us to come to this race, and we didn't have the favorite for the race, so we tried to race smart, and in the end, we played our cards perfectly. So I'm so happy.
And the last kilometers has been very, very dangerous in the last descent.
Yeah, I was watching the map on my Garmin. I think the guys that were in front of me, I think they were maybe too focused on the situation in the race and not so much the roads. And I could see it was a sharp corner coming up that they ended up crashing in. But yeah, in the end, I was just happy to keep it upright and just stay fresh as possible for the end.
So, Powless was navigating with the map on his head unit, and that's why he didn't crash when Mohoric went wide. Very interesting. Moving on, the road events at the Olympic Games came to an end last week with the individual time trials. Time trials of redemption or resilience in a lot of cases. We'll start with the women's, where Annemiek van Vleuten stormed around the 22k course to add a gold medal to the silver that she'd won in the road race. The Dutch woman said she'd taken herself off social media after the furore around the Dutch team's performance in that road race in order to fully concentrate on the time trial in a positive frame of mind. And it clearly worked. She was almost a minute clear of Marlen Reusser of Switzerland in second and pre-race favourite Anna van der Breggen in third. The pre-race favourite in the men's was Wout van Aert, but whilst he was right up there in the hunt for the medals after one lap, he faded on the second and eventually would finish sixth. It seems like that time trial was one race too many for him after a busy and very successful few weeks. Head and shoulders above everybody else on the day, though, was his trade teammate Primož Roglič. From the very first time check, he was setting the benchmark, and whilst everybody else faded over the second lap, Roglič held his pace to win by over a minute. And he didn't even seem too exhausted at the finish, did he? He crossed the line, but carried on racing until an official stopped him. Roglic's bounce-back ability seems to know no bounds, does it? He's experienced the biggest of disappointments over the past couple of years, but every time he's come back quickly to his winning ways. And for Slovenia, it was yet another high-profile cycling win. That nation is going cycling crazy, and this is the reception that Roglič received upon his return home. Thank you very much to Primož Trila for allowing us to use that video. I've got a feeling we are going to see a few more Slovenian cycling megastars over the next few years. They've certainly got a few heroes to look up to after all. Behind Roglič in Tokyo, the battle for the silver and bronze really couldn't have been any closer. Just 4.3 seconds separated second through to fifth place, which according to Dr. Xavier Disley on Twitter, equates to just over 1 watt of power. Absolutely remarkable. The two people on the right side of those times were Tom Dumoulin with the silver and Rowan Dennis, who took the bronze. For Dumoulin, I'm sure it felt like a win in itself. The Dutchman took time away from the sport to assess his career and his life, only returning to competition in June at the Tour de Suisse. Here's what he had to say to us after the race.
It's super special. I mean, everybody knows that I had a strange year. I was overtrained in the spring, and also mentally I definitely needed this step back to take a helicopter view of my cycling career, about my life, about what I wanted to do in the future. And it was very necessary, useful, and very cool also. I had a really good time actually. And I really found my love for the bike, for professional cycling, and I set my goals, especially to today actually. I really wanted to get a medal here and aim for the highest, and which was a medal for me, maybe not even gold, but I'm super happy with silver. This is a silver medal with a gold touch for me.
Gotta love seeing Tom Dumoulin back to his best. The two riders on the wrong side of those times were Stefan Kung and Filippo Ganna, and of the two, it's Kung I feel sorry for most. I mean, Ganna already has a World Championship win in the time trial and also has the track events to focus on at the Olympic Games, whilst for Kung, this was yet another time where he came very close with no cigar. He was just fractions of a second away from that bronze medal, adding to the heartache of losing that first Tour de France time trial to Pogačar. And there were two other great stories from the time trials, and that was of the two refugees who competed. In the men's, Ahmad Badreddin Weiss fled Syria with some of his family a few years ago and competed for the Olympic refugee team in the men's time trial, whilst in the women's, Masoma Alizadeh was not only riding her first Olympics, she was riding her first ever time trial. Zada is a refugee from Afghanistan who now lives in France. And she spoke brilliantly and eloquently in interviews after the race, talking about the hardship she'd experienced as a youngster, but then also as an adult. Trying to even ride a bike in Afghanistan as a woman is frowned upon, and she would be frequently pelted with stones or even run off the road by cars. Something that sounds so alien to most of us. What made me so impressed, though, with what she's achieving is that you get the sense that it's more about helping other women in her situation than it is about helping herself. I love all these different stories from the Olympic Games. Speaking of which, the track racing started today with the women's and men's team sprints and pursuit qualifying amongst other events. Don't forget to tune into it live on GCN Plus if you're in the right territory. I'll have a full roundup next week, but if you haven't already seen it, make sure you check out Manon's big preview for the week here on GCN Racing's YouTube channel. Right, back onto the road, and up in France we had the 3-day Tour de l'Ain, a race that enjoyed a huge profile last year. It's one of the first pro races to take place after lockdown. This year's field wasn't quite so stacked, what with the Olympics just before and the Clásica San Sebastián on at the same time, but it's a race that has historically marked opportunities for young up-and-coming riders to make their first mark. Thibaut Pinot, Romain Bardet and Julian Alaphilippe all took their first pro wins at that very race. This year, it was an opportunity for Álvaro Hodge to get back to his winning ways. It's been almost 2 years since he last took a victory. A serious injury set him back soon after that one, but on stage 1, he got to raise his arms in glory once more. Here's Jez Cox calling it to the line.
So, De Koning Quick-Step are the team that are now leading out. Well strung out behind. Bonifacio has managed to get himself in though, and here goes Buhani. Coquard's gone early. Brian Coquard has gone very early on the left-hand side, but it looks to me like Hodge has opened up for the line, and it does look like De Koning Quick-Step have made this one count.
That win marked De Koning Quick-Step's 40th win of the 2021 season, and Hodge was the 15th rider from their 30-man roster to take a win this year. It's a winning machine, that team. The second stage saw a change of overall leadership though. A 5-man group had gone clear in the closing stages, but Intermarché Wanty-Gobert's Georg Zimmermann managed to bridge across to them in the last couple of Ks. He sat on to recover his energy, attacked them inside the last kilometre, and then just carried on sprinting to the win, the first of his career. With that, he also took the leader's jersey into the third and final stage, but unfortunately for him, he wasn't able to conserve that lead. That final stage was the most testing of all of them in terms of the terrain, and on the penultimate climb, whilst Zimmermann was being distanced off the back, young Australian Michael Storer was distancing himself off the front. Despite the best efforts of those behind him, Storer proved too strong, soloing to the win by 43 seconds over Andrea Baggioli. Crossing the line in first place was not just Storer's first pro win, but also his second. He'd done enough there to secure the overall classification too. Now, you may remember Storer as the rider who was thrown off the Team Sunweb training camp last year after he exited the team bubble to go and buy himself some shampoo. But I also remember how strongly he rode in support of Romain Bardet on the final mountain stage of the Giro d'Italia back in May. He's clearly talented, and judging by this tweet from Bardet, there should be a lot more to come. He said, really happy for this guy. He was flying last week at team camp and now getting the reward for all the hard work. Probably the biggest engine I've ever seen. Chapeau. The biggest engine he's ever seen. That really is quite something to be said by a rider of Bardet's quality and experience. Second place on the stage and fourth overall for Baggioli was also like a victory in itself. The Italian was absent from competition from March through to mid-July with a knee injury which required surgery. Watch out for him in the remainder of this season. Second on the GC went to Harm van Alke of Lotto Soudal, fresh from altitude camp, whilst the third step of the podium was stood on by Matteo Badalati of Groupama FDJ. Right, I will move on now to what we've got coming up on GCN+. This week we have got those track events in Tokyo, and I've got to say I'm very much looking forward to them. It always feels like there's so much more resting on the outcome in the track events in comparison to the road, where the Tour de France and other races are at a similar level in terms of prestige. With the track, Olympic gold means so much more than any other race. Those of you in Europe, except for Russia, France and Monaco, will be able to watch all the racing live or on demand on GCN+. Moving away from the Olympics, we've also got the 4-day Arctic Race of Norway starting this Thursday, with Thomas de Gendt, Alexander Kristoff and Oliver Naesen amongst the riders on the provisional start list. That race is available in the US, Europe and the Asia Pacific, except for China, New Zealand and Japan. We are also now less than 2 weeks away from the start of the third and final Grand Tour of the season, La Vuelta a España. The race kicks off a week on Saturday and we will have live coverage for you on GCN+ if you're in Europe or the Asia Pacific, except for China, New Zealand and Japan. Now, along with the live coverage, it will be available on demand, short and long highlights, and there will also be the pre and post race breakaway shows with some very special guests too. Beyond the racing, we've also got more documentaries coming out this week, one of which is focused on the track and more specifically about the development of 2 iconic Lotus bikes ridden to Olympic gold by Chris Boardman, who talks to us about the design. And we also hear from the chief designer himself, Mike Burrows. Was this the start of the cycling arms race? Here's a trailer for it.
It was definitely a groundbreaking concept.
Literally, it popped out of the mould on the day before I flew it down to Barcelona.
Watching it actually happen was that eureka moment.
there was the right people involved, the right ingredients for that particular project.
All this time I've wanted to dive deeper, and now I'm going to tell the definitive story about what I think is the world's most iconic bikes. And by the end of this film, you're going to agree with me.
Great stuff. That film will be out tomorrow or Tuesday, with a second part about the new Hope bike being ridden by Team GB at the Olympics out a little bit later. Now, just before I move on, if you haven't already seen it, we've got a new native iPad app for GCN Plus, which you can download now. I know a lot of you are using the phone app on your iPad and had a couple of frustrations, but we've now got a dedicated app, which you will hopefully find a lot more user-friendly and better to view the racing and documentaries. Now, last week, the men's Olympic XCO champs had just taken place when we filmed the show, and the day after that, it was the turn for the women. The French duo of Lecomte and Ferrand-Prévot were amongst the pre-race favourites, and the latter was right up there at the head of affairs until her coming together with Jolanda Neff saw her fall, losing a lot of time and a lot of places with it. Neff held it together though in more ways than one, riding away from the rest of the field in a demonstration of power and skill that was equally as impressive as Pidcock's the previous day. Also, like Pidcock, Neff has had to come back from injury to be on the start line in Tokyo, and it was a far more serious one. In a training crash in January 2020, she ruptured her spleen, fractured a rib and had a collapsed lung. The road to recovery was long, and she also fractured her wrist just a few weeks ago. No doubt the postponement of the Olympics, though, was to her benefit. She certainly made the most of it, though, as did the entire Swiss team, who filled all 3 podium spots, with Frey in second and Indergaard in third. In other news, there has been some good news for Team Tibco Silicon Valley, home to the likes of Sarah Giganti, Kristin Faulkner and Lauren Stevens. They announced last week that they are going to apply for a Women's World Tour licence for next year after securing additional funding from the team's sponsors. There will be up to 15 Women's World Tour teams in 2022, and wouldn't it be great to see this American team as one of them? They've certainly been pulling out some great performances over the last couple of years. Next up, some transfer and contract news, and we'll start with the news that Tadej Pogačar is not the only young rider to have extended his contract. Runner-up at the Tour de France, Jonas Vingegaard has extended his contract with Jumbo-Visma, which was due to run out at the end of next year, but will now run until at least the end of 2024. UAE Team Emirates, meanwhile, could well be the new home to sprinter Pascal Ackermann next year. The German was vocally very critical of his non-selection for the Tour de France this year and is probably looking to have a fresh start. Louis Vervaeke will move from Alpecin Fenix to Quick-Step Alpha Vinyl next year, with his role as a support for Remco Evenepoel in the mountains. Tim de Klerk's contract extension with that same team has been confirmed too. He'll be with the team until at least the end of 2023, and his role will be to support everybody, everywhere. What a guy. Meanwhile, Ineos Grenadiers have managed to nab the signature of another young super talent, Luke Plapp. The Australian is currently in Tokyo, where he'll be racing the team pursuit. His contract with Ineos is 3 years, starting on January the 1st, 2022, but he will do a couple of races with the team as a stagiaire later this year. The 20-year-old won the Australian Elite Time Trial Championships back in January, and a number of teams have been battling for his signature ever since. OK, that's all for this week, but as ever, I will be back next week with a roundup of all the racing and any other racing-related news too. Have a good week, everyone. See you soon.